welcome again to another frequently asked questions video. This is frequently asked questions number 5, and if you've seen the others, again, I appreciate the fact that you still come around and that you're still watching. So there must have been something worthwhile in there, and I'm glad that you're here. So of course, like any beekeeper, we have to talk about the weather. And in my neck of the woods, it is freezing cold still, it is raining, and guess what? Tomorrow we're going to have these huge wind events. So now, after I get done making this video, I have to go outside and get my shipping straps out and put the augers into the ground and really secure my beehives, because we're supposed to have gusts up to 70 miles an hour. So we just don't seem to be able to get a break this time of year. We had -3 degrees, and it's just rough. So anyway, again, at least we're now inside, nice and warm, and we can talk about bees. So, and I want to thank you again, those of you who submitted your questions down in the comment section underneath the last videos, and those of you sending your questions through the Fred's Fine Fowl Facebook page. And we have 7 questions today, and of course they'll be listed down in the video description so that you can see what's going to be addressed and find out if I may be talking about something that's worthwhile to you. And those of you who took the time to send in your questions, thank you so much. Before I get started, of course we have fresh squeezed hot chocolate today, because it's 35 degrees and it's terrible out there, so it's still great hot chocolate weather. The other thing is, before I get started, I like to show you, new things that are coming out or whatever, but right now I'm reading a book, and this is called Our Native Bees, and it's by Paige Embry. And the first thing, when I pick up a book, and if you've read a lot about bees, and I read all the, top sellers in beekeeping, and I'm always interested when I'm starting up a new book. If they teach me something new right out of the gate there, it's already a great investment. I'll put a link to this book down below, but you know what she started off with? She said honeybees cannot pollinate tomatoes. And I thought, that can't be true. I mean, honeybees, that's all we talk about is how they pollinate the vegetables and everything. But apparently, physically, honeybees cannot get into the flower to pollinate tomatoes. And I learned that out of this book by Paige Embry, right off the bat. Native honeybees, there's thousands of them. And this is North America. I'm in the United States, northeastern United States, where it's freezing cold and the bees aren't flying. And this is a great book because it introduces you to our native pollinators and how fantastic they are. And they're the ones that are pollinating tomatoes, among other things. So that's an interesting little factoid right off the bat. So let's get right into the questions here. The first one comes from Diedrich, D-I-D-D-R-I-C. Thank you for that. Do you have small hive beetles in your area? Okay, that's, normally when we talk about pests where I live, remember, I live in the snow belt and it's extremely cold, and it's cold for a big part of the winter, of course. Small hive beetles are very low on the spectrum of things that I'm concerned about when it comes to my bee yard. We worry about varroa, and of course I have the hygienic bees that take care of those. I have seen 1 or 2 small hive beetles. By the way, when they call these things small hive beetles, if you're used to hunting for varroa, which are very tiny, when you see a small hive beetle, they're actually pretty big and easy to spot. And if you see them, they're all tucked in somewhere, they're hiding out, and that's because the honeybees are chasing them around. They don't put up with them. And so, I guess the question is, am I coping with them, and am I treating, or did I set up beetle traps and things like that? And I really don't. And one of the ways I was able to observe the way my bees handle small hive beetles was with the observation hive. And we're always aware, because sometimes when you look at frame designs and stuff, especially the plastic frames, people see things like this. These are the Acorn heavy wax plastic frames, and these are what I often put in my beehives. Notice that there's these little gaps around them, and people will say, well, you just provided a perfect place for small hive beetles and other pests to tuck themselves in and hide away from the bees. What I noticed was that my bees were filling these areas up with propolis, so when they found small hive beetles in these little corners and nooks that I could see in the observation hive, they actually came along and jailed them up by using propolis and sealing them in. So basically burying them alive. it's hard to spot them because they're so thoroughly run out by the bees. And it's also why when I set up my beehives, if it's the inner cover on the top, I make sure that my bees can get up in there, because what I'm doing is allowing my bees access to get up into all areas of the hive body so that they can run out things like small hive beetles. So the other thing is, often when my bees are casting out developing pupa and so on, it may actually be because small hive beetles are getting in there and trying to reproduce, especially in the cells for the drones. Drones are just seem to be food for everything. And also, of course, for the varroa. So, now I'm rethinking it. I always thought they're casting everything out because there must be a varroa in there, but it also may be a coping mechanism for getting rid of small hive beetles. So the bottom line is, do I treat for small hive beetles or do I have traps for small hive beetles? And I don't. The only defense that I really have for the small hive beetles is to make sure that the colonies are loaded and strong and vibrant and healthy. And it seems to me that those who have heavy small hive beetle infestations also have either an oversized colony of too many boxes, too many frames, and a small cluster of bees that can't really manage the area. And when they do that, they just can't keep up with everything that's going on. They can't police it. So a small colony of bees with a big space to protect and guard would probably have a problem keeping up with small hive beetles, because again, those beetles are going to develop in the stored honey and in the areas that are not frequented by your bees. So you probably want to make sure and size down your colonies to match the number of bees that are in it. So the hive bodies shouldn't be excessive with extra space. I'm kind of guilty of that because I leave a lot of honey on through winter so my bees can survive, but that's because the clusters and the bees going into fall, their numbers are high. This year, you notice I had some single deep boxes going into winter, and that's because I had small clusters of bees. So now if I had to treat, I just did some research. So one of the top traps, the people that do set traps up for small hive beetles are using beetle gels, and they say that they're baitable and non-toxic, and they put oil in them like mineral oil, and sometimes even cooking oil, I guess, will kill the beetles because they fall into it, they get stuck and they suffocate and they die. So again, I don't use these traps, but I will put some in the link so you can check them out and read them on your own. I'm not a good source to come to find out how do you treat them, because there are other things too that go on. I keep the area around my beehives trimmed down really well. I have a flock of free-ranging chickens, and they go right through the bee yard every day. They could care less about the bees. But the small hive beetle goes through a gestation period where they have to, after they hatch out in the hive somewhere, they have to leave the hive and they have to go get in the ground. That's when you're going to get them, in my opinion, rather than messing with traps and stuff inside the hive. Let's have bees that can handle them, number one. And number two, if there are small hive beetles, when they leave the hive, we want to get them there. So there's a lot of research done. The chickens will eat the larvae if they see them crawling around. The other thing is ants eat them. And then if you want to go a step further, look up nematodes. There are nematodes that you can actually buy in, and they're in suspension in water, and you actually pour it on the ground around your hives, and the little nematodes, little worms, go down into the dirt, and they'll seek out and kill. They parasitize and feed upon the small hive beetle larvae. So, and then they reproduce on the larvae, and then they exponentially spread out and actively hunt small hive beetle larvae. So while they're outside of the hive, you can get them then. I don't do, as I've already said, I don't do anything inside the hive for that. I don't have any beetle traps. I have zero experience with that. There are a lot of people on YouTube already that are doing a lot for small hive beetles. They just call it SHB sometimes. And I recommend that you go look it up. If you've got a problem, if you pull the lid off of your hive and you see a bunch of them clustered in a corner and stuff, and those are the ones you can see, and they're kind of spread out and the bees are lined up and they're kind of keeping them corralled there, you might want to consider some kind of trap. The other place that you're probably going to find them is if you've got solid bottom boards on the bottom board all the way in the back, again, pushed to the corner because the bees aren't putting up with them. They're always pushing them back. And you want to keep them from exiting the hive, reproducing, and then of course as a beetle they can fly. So they can fly right into the hive once they're adults. That's how they get there in the first place. They're smelling the honey and they're smelling the beeswax and everything, they're following those scents. If you could see their antennae, they sense the air just like Japanese beetles do, and then they follow that pheromone and they go right into those hives. So especially if you've got a big die out through winter and then spring comes along and you don't clean that out right away, seems to me that's a great place for the small hive beetles to go and set up shop. Or if you've got a very minuscule number of bees that are just making it and there's still lots of honey left in there. It happens a lot in the spring. You see the colonies and they might be starving, but there's still a lot of honey resource. See, their defenses are down, the resources are high, and that's just prime for small hive beetles to move in. I think that we're also at an advantage here in the Northeast because it's so cold so much of the year. I just think they're not, they don't do really well up here, so the numbers naturally would be down. So predators in the soil, nematodes, traps if you need them, strong colony, healthy colony with enough space reduction so that they can manage where they're living. So I hope that answers that question. And then number 2, open feeder in the hive. This is by Francis Moore. And Francis asked if, we do open feeding inside the colonies to get them through dearth periods and stuff, and some of the feeders have open troughs. Francis wants to know if we put water inside the hive, if that's a benefit. I personally would not, and the reason being that water is really not a food. Water puts a lot of humidity in the air, and the bees do a lot to control the humidity inside the hive. So at different times of year, the water works against them. I personally would not want to increase humidity. Of course, we put sugar syrup and things like that in there, and of course it's only early spring to get them through those rainy periods and stuff when they're trying to keep up with their brood. During times of dearth, we feed to keep them from attacking each other and robbing each other out, looking for resources. So the syrup is one thing, but just putting water in there I feel is unnecessary because they can find water everywhere. In the wintertime, even when there's frost and condensation inside the hive, the bees actually utilize the condensation inside the hive to hydrate when they can't exit the hive because of heavy weather. So adding water, I feel, is unnecessary, and I think may actually cause problems by increasing the humidity. So I don't think it's worth it. Much better just to provide freshwater sources outside your hive to make sure that your bees have plenty. Next one is from St. Germain. And deep and medium boxes, what role do they play? So when you look at beehives, the way I use my beehives, the way I set them up, I have the bottom board and I always have a deep box. And that deep is always started off as a brood box, and then of course they build their resources into that box, and then we start to add boxes as we go up. And also in the past I've done double deeps and then a medium super after that. I don't ever use the shallow supers. They're very small, and the question is, why have the differences? What does it matter? Well, one of the things is if you're going to have one box and only one box, then the deep is going to be what you'll have. And the best illustration of the comparison between the two, this is a medium frame, so it goes with a medium super. And then this would be a deep. So we can see the differences. The other thing is, we know that when we start out on a deep frame, that they're going to build brood, and the brood pattern is going to be pretty large. And that allows them to have a continuous area of brood without having to jump over and come around and go to other frames or migrate up into other frames and use those for brood. So the deeps are pretty good size for the bees to grow their brood on. The other thing is that the mediums are lighter weight. So when we're talking about honey supers, if I have a, when we go into the fall, a lot of people just walk up to each colony and you try to lift it to see how heavy it is. Bees are heavy, honey is definitely heavy. So if you've got deep boxes, you're looking at a box that weighs, if this were just honey, if this were honey super and it's a deep, you're looking at 43, 44, up to 70 pounds per deep when it's full of honey. So, a gallon of honey weighs about 12 pounds. So, and kilos, that's 5.44 kilos for those of you who are using the metric system. So then you jump up to a minimum of 42 pounds for a full deep super, and that's 19.05 kilos starting. So then it goes up from there. It's heavier. So it's a physical limitation. If you're lifting off these boxes and maintaining your hives, do you want to be lifting 65 pounds when it comes to taking that off? And this always interests me because people will have flow hives, as I do, and you have the Flow Super, and I have the 7-frame Flow Supers, and that's over half a gallon per frame. So sometimes when people are asked, I notice, because I read some of the comments on YouTube when people have their flow hives out there, and people say, oh yeah, I took off that, the Flow Super first and I inspected that bottom box. You lifted 70 pounds off of there? Or you pulled it out, you pulled individual frames? Yeah, we just lifted the box off. I don't know anybody that wants to lift a 70-pound box off, especially because there's also propolis. You're going to unglue that and you're going to pull that off. So if I have to inspect a lower box when I've got Flow Supers on, I know that it's super heavy, and I'm not frail. So when it comes time, I'm not lugging that thing off of there. You're gonna waste your bag. So I wait until I've emptied the Flow Super, and then that's the time when all the honey's been drained out. That's when I pull off that box and look at things underneath. Or before they've started to build up, that's when I pull that box off and look into the frames underneath. But when those Flow Supers are full, I'm going to be honest and say I don't pull that off of there. If somebody designs a really cool lifting mechanism that you can roll around your bee yard and it clamps onto the sides and lifts those boxes with some kind of pulley system, they're going to sell a lot of those. Because often people do want to lift their beehives and boxes and stuff and physically just can't. The medium and shallow supers are heavy on their own. When you pick that thing up and it's a medium super, that is a solid block of honey. But you're talking 40 pounds or whatever for that medium super, and you just put that on your cart and haul it away. If you're grabbing full depth boxes, unless you're ultra fit, there's a guy, Barnyard Bees. Look at that guy. He's a big dude. And I think he's lifting a lot of bee boxes. So that's a good channel to check out. He's also a good guy if you want to talk about small hive beetles. I think he has some treatments and reviews some traps. So check out Barnyard Bees. I think it's Dave at Barnyard Bees. He's got a lot of good stuff for you there. But a guy like that, he's going to lift those beehives no matter what size they are. Me, I'm just going to lift the medium supers, and then maybe I'll have a deep, but I don't want to handle those all the time. So if I have 2 deeps, that's for wintering, that stays in place. I pull individual frames out, then I move the box, then I start looking down below. So the main reason for the sizes, mediums, shallows, deeps, the deep is always a brood box. Beyond that, it's a matter of what you feel like you physically want to handle, what you want to lift. Okay, so thank you for that question. Next one is from Gabriela Reyes. How long before I can drain honey from a flow hive, and how much can I expect? This is not specific to flow hives, although that question comes all the time. When people are thinking about investing in a flow hive because they're expensive, they want to know if they're going to redeem their income, if they're going to redeem that expense through income from honey. So the thing is, flow hive's not magic. Depending on where you live and the bees you have and the resources that are in the environment and what the weather does to you through the year, you may have a great honey flow. You might just load those boxes right up, and other years you might get almost nothing. So that's not a question. If you're down in Florida, or if you're living in southern Italy, and you write to me and want to know how much honey you can expect from your flow hive and how often you're going to draw that off, your best resource for that kind of information is going to be other local beekeepers. They're going to know what's going on. But here's, even where I live, we get together once a month and we have breakfast and we talk about how our hives and everything's doing. And beekeepers in the same region have widely different success rates when it comes to how much honey they take off. Even survival rates through winter are vastly different, and within the same apiary, colony by colony, their production is different. So I can say that for me, northeastern United States, snow belt, Great Lakes region, 1,300 feet above sea level. So if you look, the coast of Lake Erie is 500 feet above sea level. I'm 1,300 feet above sea level. If I get 3 harvests a year off of a single flow hive, that's a really good year for me. Often I might not get anything through spring, so that's gone away. And then in September and the beginning and the end part of September is when I'll get my greatest nectar flow, so that's when I'll get 2 draw-offs. So we could safely say where I live, and I live in an environmentally rich area for the honeybees, I'm going to get 10 gallons of honey off of one flow hive. And we can break that down economically. I get $10 for a quart of honey. Well, my wife sells it, and mostly she ends up giving it away to friends. But if she's selling it, it's $10 a quart. So that will help you work out what the honey's worth and how much you're going to have. But and then again, that's after the honey has been built up in the lower boxes first, and then the flow hive is always extra, and then that's going to come off for winter. So 3 cycles out of the flow hives, 7 frame flow hives. So if you have the 6 frame flow hives, the number of cycles is probably the same. You're just going to get less honey because there's less space for them to put that in. But that question is so wide and varied and so dependent upon how well your bees are doing, how many bees are in the colony, you know. So the results that I just described to you are based on a very strong colony in the exact same apiary, exact same area, same environment, same temperature fluctuations, same weather conditions. I'll have another colony that gives me 1. So the performance colony to colony is not even the same. So I'm sorry to say there's no set. It's like any agricultural activity. You really can't count on anything until it actually happens. You're just going to do your best and do the best for the bees, keep them as healthy as you can, keep the numbers up, and then hope for the best when it comes time. When that nectar flow hits, just like in the spring, you can get all excited because all of a sudden, you know, there's all these great resources in the environment, and then boom, 3 weeks of rain. And the bees just aren't going to go out there and get it. So it's so widely variable, there's no great answer for that, I'm sorry to say. Number 5, what's the best landing board height? I meant to bring in landing boards and show you. Here's the thing, and again, this depends on where you live and what's after your bees and what works for you. But for me, there's no set landing board heights, but I do not, if you see my apiary, I don't put the beehives on the ground ever. Some people just set up little pedestals and level things off and set their bees right on a gravel base or something right on the ground. The reason I don't do that is where I live. The other thing is mice are going to move in right under your beehive if they can find an enclosure there. If you've got those double bases with a nice ramp on the front, those look great. But that's wood to ground contact, so I avoid that because that's rot. The other thing is moisture and humidity and everything else builds up on her hive that sits right on the ground. So I elevate everything. And the other thing is, and I was trying to get videos of this because this is a great behavior and it's hilarious, is skunks come and visit the beehives. And I have, if I can find it, I'm going to put it off to the side in this video, but I have night videos of skunks in the rain raiding beehives. So the skunk comes along, and I had one beehive that was probably, 8 inches off the ground. So even that's too low. Because the skunk comes up and it puts its forelimbs on that landing board and it scratches at the entry board. And what happens is the guard bees come out to get the skunk, and this is nighttime. And then the skunk just starts eating them. So the skunks are just, they're eating the honeybees. But it was hilarious because the skunk was being stung and it was making these weird noises. It's rolling around in the grass and it goes right back up there again and starts raking them in, and it's getting stung and it falls on the ground and rolls around. So I put 3 cameras out there, and of course it rained heavy the whole time and I couldn't get the audio. And of course after that I elevated that hive a little more. But one of the reasons in my area is that skunks are going to eat your bees. I don't know how many bees he's getting, but skunks are tenacious. Now I like having them around because another thing they do is a skunk will find in-ground yellow jackets and they'll dig them out. It shows you how tough they are because the yellow jackets are stinging them and they're just going to dig them out. But what happens is that as you raise your beehives higher, the skunk doesn't want to get up on its hind legs. Now its whole underbelly is exposed, and that's where the bees will start to sting the skunk. So skunks go after the lower hive entrances first, so you can actually do it that way. So there are a lot of reasons for elevating your beehives well off the ground. So good solid structure, make sure that critters and stuff can't get up in there. The other thing is if you've got ants and things that are going to your hive, then having them off the ground allows you to cope with that better too. And if your hive support has an overhang for your entry board, then mice and things have to jump around to get in. So again, it just creates more barriers for things that would feed off of your bees. So the other thing is you have to consider how tall is the top of your hive going to be? My tallest hives only have 4 or 5 boxes on them. So you also have to have a manageable height. And of course, the higher it is off the ground to begin with, the more heights you're going to be dealing with. So there's that. But there's no best. It's a matter of what's convenient for you, what the environment's like where you live. I do recommend though that you keep them off the ground so the air flows underneath, and also so that you reduce predation on your bees. So number 6, do bees have trouble removing dead drones? What are drones good for? Okay, now these are beginning questions, so that's good. What are drones good for? That's an awesome question because nobody really knows. If you're in the beehive, a drone, first of all, what kind of bees are in your colony? You have a worker bee, that's the smallest one. Everything that happens in that hive that's awesome comes from that worker bee. Then there's the queen. She's the largest and the longest, and she lays eggs. And all the bees in that colony have come from that queen. And after that, you've got drones. Drones are male bees. And I like to use them as an example when I'm talking to school kids, because what would it be like to be a male bee? What's it like to be a boy in a bee colony? Is it awesome? When it comes time for a drone to hatch out, first of all, the drone took up more resources to hatch than any other bee. It took longer in the cell before it hatched out. When it did come time for the drone to hatch out, it doesn't even hatch itself out. The nurse bees chew it out, and the little drone just sits there and its big head comes up. And when the drone comes out of its cell, what's the first thing it's doing? Poking at the nurse bees to feed it. So it doesn't even find its own food. It gets fed by nurse bees on the brood frame. So now what's the drone do? Well, it's the fattest bee in the hive. And they're very distinctive. Again, I'll put one off to the side here if I have a video sequence showing you a drone. You most commonly see them, you see them on the landing boards. Their whole job, other than consuming resources in the hive, seeking the protection of the female bees, because a drone can't even defend itself. He has no stinger. He can't bite things. When you see a drone on the landing board, you can just pick it up. They're just fuzzy, fat little bees. And when you put in a queen excluder, not only can the queen not get through it, but a drone can't get through it. So that's probably good news because you keep them away from the honey super, but it won't even feed itself. It goes up there and pokes bees around until they stick out their tongues and they feed the drone. So what's its purpose? The drone is going to be responsible for the genetics of that hive, and they're going to fly out to what's called a drone congregation area, and they're hunting for a queen. So when the drone bee is inside the colony and there's a virgin queen in that colony and she's going to hatch out, a lot of people think, oh good, I have drones and they're going to breed with that queen. No, they're not. They could care less about their sister queen that's going to hatch out there, because the genetics are the same. She's from the same colony, so those drones aren't even looking to mate with her. They zip out of there and they fly off to some distant spot. And drone congregation areas, by the way, remain constant for years and years. So if you find a place where drones congregate and wait for virgin queens, that's going to be the same location for many years to come. Who knows how they decide what a great spot is for them to go, but their whole purpose is to breed with a virgin queen. So there again, when you're talking to school kids, they're like, oh, she has to breed, he breeds with a virgin queen and he just eats everything and he loafs around and he doesn't contribute to the hive except for his genetic material. That doesn't sound terrible. Well, you know, when he breeds with the queen, if he's one of the lucky ones, what are his chances? What are a drone's chances of mating with a virgin queen? Less than 1%. Yeah, because first of all, let's remember, drones are big and heavy. They don't feed themselves. So when they're on the landing board and they're deploying to their drone congregation area, you know how long they're gone before they come back because they're all out of food and they're hungry and starving, need to be fed? On average, 25 minutes. So that drone zips out. If he goes a couple of miles to the drone congregation area, he only gets a few minutes to buzz around, hoping that that just happens to be the time that a virgin queen showed up that needed to be mated. And then he flies back all exhausted, lands on the landing board and begs for food. And then he gets shelter. So then that's the genetic stock of that colony. So that drone's whole purpose is to fly out every day, several hours a day, 25 minutes at a time, zipping out, coming back, eating, zipping out, coming back and eating. And most of them will never ever mate. So now that he's loafing around, well, that's not so bad. Kids think, well, that's not bad. He just goes and looks for them and he eats stuff and he loafs around. No, because what happens is then the females are going to turn on that drone. And when the weather gets cold or when the resources are low, the drones are the first to go. And they're going to drag them out and they're going to let them starve to death outside. They're going to refuse to feed them. They're going to kick them out of the colony. They don't chew them apart. They don't kill them. They let them starve to death. They just kick them out and don't let them back in. So once drone eviction time happens and they're kicking out all the drones, then the guards sit there and don't let the drone back in. So they actually starve those male bees to death. So is it awesome to be a male bee in a colony? I don't personally think so. But back to the original question, since I completely derailed it to talk about the male bee and what happens to it. Oh, that's the other thing. If a queen dies, if an entire colony is dying, you can have female worker bees, all the worker bees are female, you'll get what's called a laying worker. And that is a ditch effort to keep the genetic line of those bees out in the environment. So you'll get a bunch of drone and nothing else. That's a sign that the eggs that you have, that the brood that you have, is coming from a worker and not a queen. Because it's nothing but drone. And the cells are bigger. And those drones fly out, and that is a dying colony trying to keep its genetics out in the world and connected with other bees so that other queens will get those genetics. And a queen is going to mate with 11 or 12 drones on her virgin flight. Hopefully, if she doesn't get eaten by a bird or snagged by a dragonfly or something else that eats bees. Drones get eaten all the time too, because that's a fat, juicy bee flying through the air that can't sting or bite. So then, if they die inside the colony, and when you see the landing board and see a worker bee, really, you know, they all kind of walk around drones like they don't even know they're there because they don't want to be the one that has to drag them off. Drone bees are so big and bulky and heavy that a worker bee cannot even fly away with it. At very best, they drag them to the edge of the landing board and they fall off together. And the way a worker bee's feet are designed, if you look at them really close, they have these little hooks like this that allow them to grab onto things, which includes clinging to a branch, for example, or clinging to the side of the hive and then they sleep. The way their little joints are designed, once they lock onto something, they don't have the physical ability to flex back and release it. In other words, they can't take a piece and fly into the air and then release it. They have to land first and push their hooks off of it and then let go of it. And it's the same with the drone. So when a worker's buzzing at maximum RPMs and her wings are beating and she barely gets it off of there, she falls to the ground with it, and only then can she release that drone. So drones are just lugs all the time. They have one purpose, and that's to continue the genetics of the colony that they come from. And they fly long distances, and the bees have a terrible time. So when you see dead bees on your bottom board, and a lot of them are drones, just sweep them off and help your bees out. The reason they disappear once they land in front of the hive is because ants eat them. All these other insects feed on the dead bodies of bees and drones. And as I said before, my chickens don't eat them. I wish my chickens would eat dead bees, but they just don't. They stay away from any stinging insect. They don't eat wasps, they don't eat hornets, and they don't eat bees. But they will poke around and they will eat those beetle larvae and the beetles themselves if they can get them. So, yeah, that's what drones are good for. Genetics. With other queens from other colonies, never their own. All right, and then the last one here is from Chad. Cell size and bee size. Are bees, would bigger bees be better? Now, I'm actually glad that Chad asked this question because I've had this, I did an experiment a while ago where I wanted to see, if you look at flow frames, the plastic frames are much larger than normal brood comb and worker bee frames. And I was really kind of surprised that some of the people that actually have a lot of experience with bees were saying, well, that's going to make bigger bees. And a larger cell, man-made or not, is not going to result in a larger bee. And the reason is, that's just the environment in which the bee is developing. And the bees, of course, the hexagonal cells, are built based on the physical dimensions of the workers that build them. That's where they come up with that size to begin with. But if I put a bee in a big open petri dish and I incubate, once it has royal jelly, once it's developing larvae, then if that's in an open petri dish and it gets fed and grows into a worker, all the workers are going to be the same, even if it's in a completely open space and incubated to the proper temperature so it can develop, even when it goes into the pupa state, where you're no longer feeding it and it just continues to grow. If that's in an open larger cell, the pupa does not develop to a larger scale bee because the physical dimensions of the bee are genetic, they're not environmental. So in other words, I can't create a bunch of plastic brood comb and have my queen lay a bunch of eggs in that and then result in physically larger bees. Those are two different things. The environment that it develops in is one thing, and then the physiology based on genetics is a completely different thing. So the physical size of the bee is not going to be altered because it's developing in a larger cell. It just doesn't work that way. Now, so the next question, part of this question is, bigger bees, are they better? Bigger, you have to understand there's a certain amount of facility designed into the bee. So that the honeybee has to be able to access flowers, has to be able to get down inside them. Every aspect of the honeybee is designed for its pollination purposes, reproduction, and then genetic success. So adaptations through thousands of years have led us to the physical dimensions of the current Apis mellifera, which is the bee that we manage. That is our agricultural bee that is non-native to the United States. And but it has arrived at those physical dimensions on its own through many thousands of years of adaptation. So to think that we can modify its environment, give it bigger cells or something like that, and result in a larger bee just doesn't happen. Big bees are big already. Bumblebees, for example, they're nice and big, very limited, so, and that of course affects how well they can glean their resources from the environment. The physical capabilities, longer tongues and things like that allow them to access different plants and nectar that grow in the specific area. Those things go hand in hand. Where the flowers and stuff support life, the things that can glean their resources necessary for reproduction from those plants will also be supported and will blossom and continue in those areas. If they're incompatible, if this bee can't get resources from this plant, like we started in the beginning when we talked about the tomato, if there were nothing but tomato flowers around, I guess the honeybee just couldn't do it. So that would be the end of it. So instead you have bees like the bumblebee that gets a hold of the tomato flower and vibrates, the flower's hanging down and the bee grabs it and vibrates a lot. Now the pollen is vibrated into reproduction. So something the honeybee apparently can't do. That's some interesting stuff. But the size of the cell does not result in either a smaller bee. If the cell were even smaller, I don't know what happens then, but it's not going to result in a smaller bee. It's going to result in a bee maybe that doesn't happen at all, because those cells are built by bees of the same species. So when the bees are building the cells, they're building them to their physical dimensions, which means they're going to accommodate the developing pupae of a bee of their own species. So you can't grow out a bumblebee in a honeybee cell. And I hope that, that's probably a fairly complicated area to get into, bee genetics. Larger bees, smaller bees. There are smaller honeybees, there are, but they're a species unto themselves. So you can't alter that just by providing. So when I had the flow frames and people were saying, oh, this is going to be big bees or they're going to be drones, well, I had workers hatching out of the flow frames themselves. So those were oversized frames, but I noticed the capping, the brood cap was not all the way out to the edge. The brood cap was actually recessed inside, and it is domed, and it's, of course it's porous because they respirate through it and everything else. But it did not result in a bee that was any different in physical dimension than any other bee in that colony that hatched out of a normal cell that was made by the workers there. So that's it. If you have questions for me, please put them down in the comments section of this video. And of course I'll put links here into the video for you for the book that I mentioned, maybe the frames, And some of the traps that I've been told work well. If I'm recommending a small hive beetle trap, it's not because I've used it, just because it's consistently what others are telling me will work. And that's pretty much it. Thank you for watching and for spending part of your Saturday with me. And I hope you guys have a great week, and I hope your weather is much better than mine. Thanks as always for being here.